I'm so excited to get this out to you guys. Many people see the Snyder Cut release as one of the few victories for fans in recent years. Now, I know that there's been a recent event involving Zack Snyder, in which we've covered many times on this channel. It has some of us thinking a little differently about him. As of me shooting this video, I still think he's a sucker for it. But it's not like HBO Max doesn't come with my plan. But also, after the fact that I put that poll out, my audience made it clear that you guys want a more ripified review, sort of like we did with that Birds of Prey video. So I will be sure to adopt this approach going forward when we're reviewing movies, that is. For those of you that are new here, what this means is that there will be three main parts of this video. First, I'm going to take you on a journey and go through the comic book history when it comes to the Justice League. Then I'll give you a summary of the events of the Snyder Cut Justice League, and then I'll give you my thoughts on the movie. So needless to say, there will be plenty of spoilers, and I'm not interested in even comparing the Joss Whedon version of this movie. I'm not really even knowledgeable on what went down behind the scenes with that. Is it reshot? Are some of these scenes original? I don't really care. But the reason why we do things like this is because I'm a comic book guy through and through, which is the medium in which these characters come from. So my analysis of a movie is largely influenced, though not only, by my knowledge of the characters in combination with the movie itself. I'm not asking for a direct adaptation of what, let's say, we see in the comic books, though that would be awesome. It's more about just honoring these characters that they're adapting. So the golden question is, does this feel like the Justice League? And understanding that many of you do not engage in that expensive hobby of collecting and reading these books, hopefully this review will help you with some of that perspective. This video may be as long as the Snyder Cut itself, so I'll be sure to make the comic book history portion of this video as visually stimulating as possible. There will also be chapters marked if you are watching this on YouTube. So let's get into the extensive comic book history of the Justice League. I'm sure Google normies are gonna address the slight errors that I make in this video because I'm sure some of them will be there. Let's get into it. Justice League. There's a lot of misconceptions about this team that consists of many wrongful yet understandable assumptions. The Justice League is seen as the team of DC superheroes and just regular heroes, sort of like what Avengers is to Marvel Comics, and rightfully so, again. But it wasn't the first big team that we saw with DC Comics. That would actually belong to the Justice Society of America, which predates the Justice League by about 20 years. This team was the focal point of All-Star Comics. Many of the original Justice League members were actually a part of the JSA first, or a version of them was part of it. Both Flash and Green Lantern were part of the original Justice Society of America, for example, but it was their first depictions. So that would be Jay Garrick Flash and Alan Scott Green Lantern. Apparently back then they had a rule in which characters that had their own series couldn't really be a member of that team, which is why early on you don't see a whole lot of Batman or Superman, as they were members of the Justice Society of America, more honorary members. However, you do end up seeing Wonder Woman, who by the end of All-Star Comics issue 11 becomes a mainstay. And issue 36, which dropped in 1946, was one of the big team-ups which looked like basically the Justice League because it had Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, and a Flash and a Green Lantern. I know we're supposed to be talking about Justice League, but I wanted to mention this historical point because many people don't understand just how old some of these characters are. You may also be wondering how both teams were able to exist at the same time when the Justice League was created. Well, that's because the retcon shortly after the formation of the Justice League solidified that they were part of different Earths. So let's talk about the actual Justice League. The Justice League of America first appears in The Brave and the Bold before they ever got their own series. This is in the year 1960, and the original team is Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Superman, Batman, Martian Manhunter, Hal Jordan Green Lantern, and Barry Allen Flash. As with most books, you don't get the origin story right away, not from the get-go. The team is already established and is summoned by Aquaman after he discovers Starro, a giant alien starfish that is trying to conquer the planet. Superman and Batman are too busy at the time, so the initial call consists of all but them. Cool thing to note is that the first chairman that we see of the Justice League is not Batman, it's Flash. That doesn't mean that Batman wasn't a chair before, it's just that Flash is the first that the audience sees. He's the one that's giving the orders to the team, and Batman and Superman aren't actually part of the defeat of Starro. The first official Justice League ongoing series is the Justice League of America, which was released later that year. The first few villains of the Justice League in that book are Despero, then Simon Magnus, then Konjar Ro. The important thing to note is that the Green Arrow joins the team by issue 4, so the first additional member, aside from their mascot Snapper of course, is the Green Arrow. No, we don't get the actual origin of the Justice League until about issue 9. Then members of the Justice League tell Snapper the story of the formation. Martian Manhunter flies to a scene where he finds a stone giant from the planet of Epilogue. Basically, a bunch of warriors were sent to Earth to duke it out so they can decide who will then replace the recently killed ruler or dead ruler. There was a total of 7 of them, and with their powers, they could turn inhabitants on that side of Earth that those meteors landed to life forms that were similar to their own. This is why Martian Manhunter saw people turning into stone. Though defeating the stone giant, things hit the fan when Martian Manhunter gets near a meteor from which the alien still hadn't emerged yet, and then he starts to slowly turn into wood of all things. Aquaman tells his side of the story, and he suffers the same fate after defeating one of the Epilogue's enemies, and then he turns into wood when he goes near again the one that hadn't emerged yet. The same thing happens to Wonder Woman, then Green Lantern, then the Flash. A wood-like being though then appears, and they work together to turn parts of themselves back from, well, being wood-like, so they can then defeat this alien. After that, they head to the last meteor, which is in Greenland. Superman and Batman are already fighting him. Once defeated, the 7 OG members agreed to then form the Justice League. So, it is from the battle with the Epilogue meteor aliens that gave them this idea to sort of start a club or society. What I love about this era of comic books is how they didn't use the gimmick of constant reboots to sell the books. So back then you got high issue series that lasted, well, decades. The first JLA book went all the way to the late 80s, over 200 books. Let's quickly go through some of the historical points over this series. Brought on in issue 14, the next hero to join the Justice League is the Atom. And by issue 21, we get one of the anticipated crossovers in the Justice League and the Justice Society of America. It's not the original lineup, but it is the JSA that consists of Atom, Black Canary, Dr. Fate, Jay Garrick, Flash, Alan Scott, Green Lantern, and Hawkman. This is important because it acknowledges the existence of 2 Earths, and is shortly after the 2 Flashes met. That's when this whole thing takes place. It's also important because it sets the precedent of calling a clash between Earths a crisis, and that's in the name of the arc. It's called Crisis on Earth 1. We'll come back to this point a little later, but they explain the existence of 2 different Earths in a way that they both exist at the same time in the same place. It's just the matter vibrates at a different speed. This is why the 2 Flashes are able to travel in and out of both of their Earths. But in this issue, the JSA are getting back together after taking 12 years off. Both the JSA and the JLA have teams of villains up to no good, but also happen to be working together. They are known as the Crime Champions, and it consists of members such as Felix Faust, Dr. Alchemy, and Kronos, as well as Fiddler, Icicle, and Wizard. After some conflict, this is when you see the classic meetup of the JLA and the JSA, which includes both Atoms and both Green Lanterns. They fight side by side and defeat the Crime Champions and vow to keep in touch in case they need to join forces again. Now this may sound really cool, but look, as we'll find out in the future, the addition of multiple universes or Earths muddied up the water, so much so that they had to come up with this epic crossover event just to try to fix this later in a series that we'll discuss. Getting back to the first JLA run though, DC liked the idea of multiple Earths so much that they added a third one, which is the centerpiece of the arc called Crisis on Earth 3, which starts in issue 29. It brings back the link up of the JLA and the JSA, but Earth 3's team consists of goofier versions of the other heroes. Here you have Superwoman, Owlman, Ultraman, Johnny Quick, and Power Ring. In this story, the Earth 3 versions of the characters are actually villains called the Crime Syndicate of America. And on this Earth, most super beings are actually criminals, unlike the mixture you see on Earth 1 and Earth 2. The Earth 3 characters aren't the exact same as they find in the fight. Superwoman's rope turns into a serpent, and Kryptonite actually powers up Ultraman, for example. But they come to the realization that both teams of superheroes have advantages on their respective Earths, so they want to fight on Earth 2 in a big showdown. Understanding they need to get rid of the JSA because they'll of course help Earth 1 heroes on Earth 2, the Crime Syndicate plans an attack on them while the other heroes are in this trance that was set by the Power Ring. Once they arrived on Earth 2, they duke it out with the JSA and actually defeat them with the planning of course, Owlman, who is basically Batman's equivalent, which sets up the scene for the showdown between the Crime Syndicate and the JLA. The JLA ends up winning and ends up imprisoning them in an interdimensional jail. The next member added to the JLA is going to be Hawkman, who joins in issue 31, and he becomes a bit of a mainstay. And throughout the mid-60s, we do see a couple of JSA appearances and a couple of team-ups with characters like the Elongated Man. There aren't many villains that they go up against that you would recognize, but there are a couple of cool clashes with the JSA. One notable book is in issue 74 with Earth 1 and Earth 2 Superman finally meeting up, and they actually end up fighting. Also, Black Canary joins the Justice League, becoming the first female aside from Wonder Woman. There is a valuable comic book in issue 95 because it gives the origin of both Dr. Fate and Dr. Midnight, but in the 70s in general, this was a weird time, and the constant jumping in of the JSA and these different timelines, different versions of these characters. There was an instance where Thunderbolt, for example, he jacks up the timeline and there's an Earth A, then there's a Crisis on Earth S. One good thing though did come from it. In issue 137, we get the introduction to Red Kryptonite, which drives Superman mad, and then we get the first big clash of Superman and Captain Marvel, who y'all now know as Shazam. Aside from Black Lightning declining, like straight up declining an offer to join the Justice League, the 70s, they're kind of forgettable when you consider the history of the Justice League in context, especially with the constant pulling in of alternate Earths. The stakes just weren't as high, and it felt really cheap at times, and even confusing with so many variations of the same heroes. But the 80s, those were different times. Now this is where we get what is potentially most relevant to this whole video, considering it's in the context of Justice League and, well, the Snyder Cut. And that's Darkseid, his first clash with the Justice League. But this isn't the first appearance of Darkseid. Let's branch off a little bit before we get back into the Justice League, so we can give you some backstory on Darkseid. Darkseid is what is called a new god. Funny enough, the new gods were actually created by the great Jack Kirby, who you often associate with Marvel and Stan Lee. But the new gods are a race of people that were created out of a war between the old gods. Well, the final moment is, let's say, or rather they describe it as this indescribable power. It strikes the world, and by the end of it, two giant molten bodies were left, and later rose the new gods. One of those bodies, those two planets, if you will, they become what is known as New Genesis, that of which the main focal point of the New Gods book is. This is where we get the protagonist, Orion, as well as the High Father, who basically is the ruler of New Genesis. However, there is the other twin planet, and that's called Apocalypse, which is ruled by none other than Darkseid, who, for whatever reason, some people call Apocalypse. It's not his name. Apocalypse is basically the reverse of New Genesis. Predictably so, there is an inevitable beef that is between the two planets, one of which makes its way all the way down to Earth, considering that Darkseid is trying to get hold of what is known as the anti-life equation, or rather he's trying to solve it. But by the end of this run, we find out that Orion is the son of Darkseid. Now, what the New Gods book did was expand on Darkseid's tyranny. He grows as a character slowly, from this sort of barely intimidating, though ruler of an entire planet, to something that is more like world-shattering, if you will. He was ultimately defeated, only to reappear in the Justice League book that we were just talking about. Up until then, Darkseid was more of this cosmic being, along with the rest of the New Gods, and they would clash with each other, not much with the heroes of Earth. That, of course, changed in the 1980s. In JLA 183, we get yet another team up between the JSA and the JLA. Only this time, a third team is added to the mix, the New Gods. Huntress is now part of the JSA, as Firestorm is with the Justice League. Now, this story is centered around the JLA and the JSA being transported to New Genesis. Of course, they don't know why. The cool thing about this book is that Superman mentions how he's been there before, and that these people of New Genesis have powers that are equal to him. But there's conflict with Orion as soon as they get there, and they end up finding out soon enough that Metron was the one, he's a new god, that actually summoned them because he needed their help. It's this comic where we get a mention of what is known as the Mother Box, and that's explained to the Justice League. This has later gone through some retcons, become a little more important, have a little more power, but as of this book, the Mother Box is just a form of electronic life used by the New Gods as both a communicator and as a healer. We'll touch more on that later because Mother Boxes end up really becoming more important to the lore. But Big Barda, Mr. Miracle, and Metron explain to the JSA and the JLA that Apocalypse has kidnapped the entire population of New Genesis, and they had the help of the Injustice Society of Earth 2. That's why they were summoned. The heroes break up in teams, and we find out how the initial conflict with the New Gods ended with the defeat of Darkseid, alluding to the idea that there's no way he could be part of this recent flare-up of violence. Only they end up seeing him as they are freeing prisoners. What we find is that the Injustice Society is helping recreate Darkseid. Now, Darkseid was initially killed, but his death basically meant being caught in like this spiritual limbo, and thus he was able to control the Injustice Society to help him out. He successfully brought back momentarily, only to be destroyed with the help of Metron to end the arc after he reprogrammed the master computer. Moving on, through the early 80s, though, we get newer members of the JLA, such as the Elongated Man and Zatanna, and by the mid-80s, you had some odd teams that consisted of Vixen, Gypsy was part of the team, Vibe was, really Martian Manhunter, he was the only original member on that team. In order to understand why this is the case, we have to reference what is my favorite major crossover event in comic books, and that's the Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's my favorite not just because of what happened in it, but what it resulted in. The Crisis on Infinite Earths happened in the mid-80s, and aside from what it meant to the comic book industry, it is a big turning point with DC Comics. As I mentioned before, the DC universe was a mess, and there were simply too many versions of the same characters, which cheapened the universe in general. This issue was specifically what the Crisis on Infinite Earths attempted to address. I'm not going to go through all of what happened in the Crisis, but for the sake of the characters in the Justice League, we need to discuss the ending and the Ramifications. The event ended with basically all of the other Earths being eliminated or like merging, essentially. There's no more multiverse, and there's only one consistent past. Well, we'll address that in a minute because they end up changing that too. But the last issue gives you some facts such as Barry Allen's Flash really being killed off and Wally West ends up becoming the Flash going forward. But the point is that you don't really know at the time which pass is used for each character. This allows for it to be patched up going into the future. In comic books, as the reader has no idea which version of the character they are going to get. We just know there's not a million versions of the same character. I appreciate this book so much, man, because DC conceded that it was a multiversal mess, and they wanted to simplify their universe. This is why many break up the legacy of the characters in like these two different sections. You have pre-crisis and then post-crisis. As a tip, you can read the secret origin line if you want to know what the origins of some of these characters are and how they changed or what they changed to. So what did the Justice League look like after the crisis on Infinite Earths? The original JLA comic line did continue technically after the crisis, but it didn't make much sense in that context. And the book ended in 1987, about a year after the crisis, with Martian Manhunter and Vixen hugging it out, and that completed the end of the JLA. The Justice League, though, got its first reboot that same year, and they had dropped the line of America part. They dropped that part of their name, which is why the book is normally seen as the first volume of Justice League. It also later turns into Justice League International before going to Justice League of America. Actually, it wasn't even Justice League of America. It was just Justice League America. The only thing that makes sense is because there was also a Justice League Europe. But in this book, the Justice League is being reformed, implying that it existed before. This reorganized Justice League has Batman, Mr. Miracle, Guy Gardner, Green Lantern, Manhunter, who else was on it? Black Canary, Shazam, and Blue Beetle. This run lasted for about 10 years and has rotating members. The reason why it's a forgettable run is because you never really see the original lineup together. Yes, Batman, Superman, and Martian Manhunter appear on occasion, but between the Justice League International, America, and Europe, you almost never see the original and most notable lineup together all at once in those books. More importantly, things are happening in those individual characters' comics that are important to those particular characters in the Justice League. The late 80s weren't all a waste, however. Remember, this is after Crisis, so we need to know the origin of this JLA. It is kept largely intact with the same conflict with the Apalexians, only there's no Batman or Superman or Wonder Woman. And Black Canary is added as an original member. Yeah, weird. They do, however, acknowledge in this Secret Origins book that of course the JSA predates them, and it consists of an entirely different team that came about in the 40s. Black Canary acknowledges this, and that this JLA, or this new Justice League, is sort of similar to what the JSA had done before them. The thing that's important to note is the fact that the Flash going forward is not Barry Allen, who most people nowadays consider to be the most popular Flash. He's not a thing really after the crisis. This Flash post-crisis, as I said before, is Wally West. He does, though, Wally, unlike a lot of the others, he remembers who Barry is, what it meant, what happened in before the crisis. Wally is carrying that burden of Barry's sacrifice. Many don't know, after Crisis, Barry really only made a few appearances. We'll talk about when he comes back later, but really between the latter half of the 80s up until the mid 2000s, Barry Allen is like non-existent, and the Flash is Wally West. As I mentioned, this run lasted about 10 years, so it ended before the 2000s. The next Justice League run doesn't come out for a while, so before we address that, let's talk about some of the other characters you'll see around the Snyder Cut. Let's first go back into the New Gods. As I said before, Darkseid was more of a cosmic being. He didn't really have all of these conflicts with Earth or the Justice League. he was more of a cosmic being in the DC universe. So you're going to want to dive into those New Gods books to really get more information on him. In that first run we talked about, New Gods, that's where you also see Steppenwolf, and that's his first appearance. He's the uncle of Darkseid, and his sister is Darkseid's mother. When we first meet him, it's in a more of a previously told story in comparison to most of the other events in the New Gods, so rather it's a flashback. It's an earlier great clash between the people of Apocalypse and New Genesis. We see that Steppenwolf is not the most fond of Darkseid and flat out tells him he doesn't like him. He also doesn't look much like he does now, and he's more like green in his appearance. What you need to know is Steppenwolf is a warrior through and through, and he's a militaristic leader. He was thought to have been killed by the High Father at that time, but of course he resurfaces later in the next New Gods run in the mid-80s, which, much like the first run, ends with a battle between Orion and Darkseid. The difference is that Darkseid decisively won and Orion was shot up by his guards. All I want to do in mentioning this is highlight how Darkseid's earlier conflicts were not with members of the Justice League. Now, for the most part, it was with people of New Genesis and mainly his own son Orion. But that doesn't mean there was no conflict at all. Shortly after the events of the Crisis on Infinite Earths, a limited series called Legends was released. Now, after Darkseid in Legends, he reminds Darkseid of the trouble that the heroes of Earth have caused him in the past. So after summoning Glorious Godfrey and Dr. Bedlam, they plan to head to Earth to humiliate all of the heroes to the point to where the only legend that exists is Darkseid's. Cool thing about this story is that this is one of the earliest depictions and the earliest appearances of Amanda Waller, who you generally associate with the Suicide Squad. Now, anyway, by the end of the first issue, the current JLA appears, and remember, the only original member here is Martian Manhunter. Darkseid, though he's making his rounds, though not there physically, he's trying to humiliate these heroes. I believe Shazam was one of them. And at the end of the entire arc, you do see some of the more notable, let's say, members of the Justice League, such as Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Many of the main DC Universe heroes, though, are also there, and they are part of this team up. So all Darkseid really did was strengthen a bond, though he had every intention of humiliating them to the point to where people turned on the Justice League. But that's all that happened in this run. They never actually fought Darkseid, and that's important to mention. He stayed on Apocalypse, he viewed from afar. But the next interaction with, let's say, classic members of the Justice League, it's interesting to say the least. There's another limited series in the late 80s called Cosmic Odyssey. We start that run with Darkseid going back to his roots, trying to find this anti-life equation. Now, in searching for it, though, he finds that there's a menace in which will require him to get the help of even his enemy. So this is a run that's a team up consisting of Batman, Superman, John Stewart's Green Lantern, Starfire's there, as well as Etrigan. And they work with both members of Apocalypse and New Genesis. This was not without conflict, because after being sought out by the High Father of New Genesis and being transported to New Genesis, Superman attacks Darkseid immediately. He's like, this is on sight. And he's confused by this temporary alliance. This part of the book is so important. We learn what exactly this anti-life equation is. And in its entirety, an entire story is told about the anti-life equation. Now, the High Father, he tells the story of a complex society that once ruled over that part of space, and they existed long before even the dinosaurs on Earth. This proud race thought that they were the most advanced beings, and after their first contact with a non-human species, they tried to conquer them instead of dealing with them as equals. They fought each other for centuries, and that once great society started dedicating like all of its resources towards figuring out how to eradicate those aliens. Then a group of scientists stumbled upon what they figured was the answer to all of their problems, and they called this the discovery of the anti-life equation. Focusing all of their resources to developing an anti-life cannon, they almost went bankrupt. Despite the immorality of it all, they let off this cannon, and as warned against, the power of it was just too uncontrollable. It consumed even the sun until it for some reason stopped, retreated, and imploded. This created a permanent interdimensional space rift, which is why Apocalypse and New Genesis are cut off from the rest of the universe. This is where we learn that it's the mother boxes that create the boom tube, which allows them to make contact with the rest of the universe. This is what explains why the Green Lantern Corps, for example, had never heard of these two planets and they couldn't locate them. We learned that Metron actually discovered the equation again, and when he did, it shattered his mind. With the help of Martian Manhunter's telepathy, we learned that the anti-life force is not just an intellectual concept. The anti-life is a sentient being. Basically, Metron poking around allowed aspects of the anti-life to enter their part of the universe, and it will end up collapsing the universe. So they all split up to deal with these aspects. Quick note, this is the story in which John Stewart miscalculated and it ended up in the destruction of the planet Xanthi. He had such a hard time dealing with this, so much so that he almost committed suicide. But this arc ends with them warding off the anti-life entity after an astral gathering, which ends up with Dr. Fate destroying the entire dimension. The Forager, however, sacrifices himself when it was him and Batman. They were dealing with this aspect on Earth. Of course, things didn't end so smoothly as Darkseid got away with a piece of the anti-life. Keep in mind that we still haven't had the big clash between Darkseid and the Justice League. It remains this way through much of the 90s going into the 2000s. Yet again, Darkseid's main conflict is with the people of New Genesis and predominantly Orion. There's a New Gods book through the mid-90s as well as an Orion book in the 2000s. The point I want to drive home is, again, Darkseid was never really presented as a great enemy to Earth in the Justice League. His nemesis is Orion. Darkseid to Orion is Joker to Batman. In the early 2000s, we do see some action in the Superman and Batman comic book starting in issue 11. It seems as if Darkseid has captured Supergirl of all people. Alongside with Big Barda and Wonder Woman, they head to Apocalypse, where we see Supergirl seemingly under the control of Darkseid. She's fighting Superman as Big Barda and Wonder Woman fight Granny Goodness and her goons. In an odd fight, or rather a game of chicken with Batman, Darkseid releases hold of Supergirl and tells them they have to leave the planet of Apocalypse. But when they're back on Earth, Darkseid immediately attacks them randomly as they've been training. He's getting Supergirl up to speed and whatnot. So about as quick as she got re-entered into the picture, she seems to get destroyed and killed by Darkseid because she steps in the way of an attack that was meant for Superman. But it was all faked. It was a faked death to give her some time to think about if this hero thing was something that she wanted to do. The whole point of that arc was just to reintroduce that version of Supergirl back into the universe. So now that we are talking about the mid-2000s, it's important to remind you that there aren't really any Justice League books being released. The characters, they team up, but it's more so in their respective books and one-offs. The mid-90s going into the 2000s, though, is where DC began to make some of those same mistakes, trying to correct them that existed pre-crisis. We'll get back to Darkseid and the New Gods in a bit, but let's get back to some of those characters that are associated with the Justice League. In 1994, an event called 0 Hour, Crisis in Time popped off. In this story, Hal Jordan, who is as powerful as he's ever been as Parallax, he's attempting to recreate the universe for the better. Of course, many heroes, including Spectre, they not with that. They don't allow him to get away with doing that, and in doing so, it creates this big bang. Let's say if the Crisis on Infinite Earths deals with the issues with simultaneous Earths existing at the same time, this was dealing with different timelines. Darkseid actually pops up in this book briefly when Metron tells him that the universe is unraveling. Darkseid doesn't, however, believe this because such a thing could not happen without him knowing, of course. But in an effort to save the day, Wally West seems to suffer a similar fate to Barry as he ups and just disappears trying to use his powers to stop this rift. Long story short, the DC universe has been rebooted, albeit a soft reboot. There are a bunch of tie-in comics as well as issue 0 comics of many of your favorite heroes to set the scene going forward. As far as the Justice League, the new Justice League is rebooted with Wonder Woman, Wally West, Hawkman, Crimson Fox, Obsidian, and Nucleon. Not very important, just wanted you to know the team. So we are back in the mid-90s, and aside from a conflict here and there with Superman, Darkseid isn't really the enemy of the Justice League, and the Justice League isn't consisting of those classic members. Back to the New Gods though, this decade added a bunch of changes to the New Gods. Quick recap. You had the original New Gods book in the 70s, a short run, which was a mini-series in the mid-80s, and then a longer series in the 80s going into 1991. We haven't discussed that, so let's fly through it. Yet again, main protagonist in New Gods is Orion, and he has daddy issues. We do get to see cool instances of Darkseid using his Omega beams, as well as more conflict on New Genesis and Civil War, as opposed to just war with Apocalypse. Darkseid and his minions are of course involved though. It's just unlike the first two books, this run doesn't end with a conflict between Orion and Darkseid. This book ends in a rather anticlimactic way with Orion and Lightray, who is another New God, and is almost a right-hand man to Orion, fighting a character known as the Dispatcher. It's a bizarre kind of meaningless ending, but an important thing to note is that we do see Steppenwolf in this comic book move into more of a subordinate role, and he's far less defiant to Darkseid, which is a big shift from his attitude in the earlier comics. I wish I could talk more about the New Gods because they were a very interesting concept and are obviously important, but it doesn't look like this aspect is much entertained in the DC extended universe, and I want to keep this in the context as much as possible. There's another New Gods book in the middle of the 90s, and there was a fight here and there and alliance here and there between Darkseid and the New Genesis New Gods, but really all this did was solidify the importance of what is known as the Source Wall, in which all of these New Gods start to become one with it, and that's how this run ends. But if you want what's really important to these characters, read Secret Files of the New Gods that was released shortly after this run. It's almost acting as if it's a series Bible slightly. Through granted goodness and the orphans, the story is told about how New Genesis and Apocalypse came to be with the creation of the fourth world, among other things. We see a mentioning of Glorious Godfrey and the female Furies, and just get more perspective on the New Gods in this continuity. Keep in mind, we've had both the Crisis on Infinite Earths and 0 Hour. This book touches on Isaiah, which is the real name of the High Father, and how Steppenwolf killed his wife. Darkseid stops the High Father from retaliation, which isn't really what happened in the original story. But as Glorious Godfrey is telling this story, he reasserts that the High Father himself launched an attack on Apocalypse, and the war ends up in the death of both Darkseid's mother and Steppenwolf, which makes Darkseid the new leader. Clearly, Godfrey is presenting Darkseid in an entirely favorable light as he's telling this story, but we see how cutthroat Darkseid is. But let's go through what is all confirmed in this book. As a peace exchange, which obviously didn't last, Orion and Mr. Miracle were exchanged between the High Father and Darkseid when they were youngsters, and New Genesis was almost destroyed when Orion killed Darkseid at the heart of the Source. So he's not in the Source right now, but the High Father is. As far as Darkseid is concerned, it confirms how he killed his brother Drax when he tried to make peace with New Genesis. His powers come from what is known as the Omega Force. And as of this part of the timeline, he is too stuck in the Source Wall. Also, fun fact, DC acknowledges how much bigger Darkseid is than everyone else. For context, Darkseid is 7'6", and the High Father himself is 6'4". Anyway, so Big Barda and Mr. Miracle are lovers and confirmed to have met at Granny Goodness Orphanage. That is classically how it really happened. Both characters, they are still alive, just living on Earth. Before we continue on, there are a handful of characters that you'll see associated with Darkseid that I haven't really mentioned. That's Kalibuk, Vermin Wunderbar, Granny Goodness, which I have mentioned her, Kanto, and Darkseid. If you throw in some of the characters I mentioned a while ago, such as like Glorious, Godfrey, these people are generally considered Darkseid's elites. Continuing on though, with the fates of some of the new guys, Metron is also not stuck in the Source Wall and had recently tried to free Darkseid. Now, Metron has been one of the most self-interested new gods, as he'll ally with whoever when it's convenient. He wants to seek knowledge. Tachyon is a character as well that was recently introduced, who was given godlike powers by the Highfather using the Source, and he's currently the leader of the new gods. We also, interestingly enough, get introduced to a mistress of Darkseid called Mortala. In this book, we also get a confirmed timeline of the new gods events. It starts with 19 billion years ago. The Source creates this universe. Then what is known as the God World forms, and once life appears, this is known as the beginning of the second world. Then Ragnarok happens and the old gods are killed off, and Apocalypse and New Genesis forms. This book confirms that the planet Earth was created 200 million years before life appeared on Apocalypse and New Genesis, but life appears on Apocalypse and New Genesis 300 million years prior to life on Earth. In terms of the continuing timeline, the beginning of the third world is when the terrestrial gods appear, and the beginning of the fourth world is when the people of Apocalypse and New Genesis reach godhood. It is also confirmed that Darkseid is one of the ones that created the schisms for the Greco and Roman gods of Earth. Darkseid gets his Omega Force powers, thus becoming Darkseid, 1300 years from today, and the timeline up until then ends with the God Wave hitting its final contraction, and the Highfather and Darkseid are stuck in the Source Wall. This is an important book because it gives the audience perspective on what's going on, but also how the existence of the new gods interacts with the rest of the DC universe. We're creeping up on the 2000s mark for both the Justice League and the new gods. As I mentioned a while back, Orion gets his own series in the 2000s. Surprisingly enough, there isn't much conflict with Darkseid aside from him fighting 1v1. Orion actually defeats him and seems to kill him after he deflected his Omega beam back to him, and well, Darkseid seemed to die. As far as the Justice League, remember when I said that after the previous run, there wasn't really a Justice League for a while? There wasn't, but there was a book called JLA, not Justice League America, just JLA. It started around 1997, and this was the Justice League that I grew up on. Superman has some sick long hair, and the original gang is back together. By the first issue, we have Superman, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Batman, and the Flash, which is Wally West. The next issue adds Aquaman, and I think this is the team that everybody will always associate with. Sure, you can add Green Arrow to the mix and swap the Flashes and the Lanterns, but this is the Justice League. I can't say enough how, to me, story-wise, this is one of the best runs of Justice League, but also was unfortunately about the last just great era of comic books by the end of this run. Just so much cool stuff happened with this squad, and the villains, even if they weren't that notable, the stories felt like they meant something. And the team remained largely consistent for the most part. Sure, you get swapping out of Atlanta, like I mentioned earlier, here and there. You got the elongated man, he might team up with them, but this book is carried by the characters you generally associate with the Justice League to this day, despite a few issues here and there with other additions. This run lasted up until the mid-2000s. Now, because of a lot of the characters you do see join the team in this run, we've already for the most part discussed. Let's focus on some of the new gods and how they interact with the Justice League. In issue 14, during the Rock of Ages arc, Darkseid does appear, but all it really is just a story told in the future, so it doesn't really matter. Justice League doesn't really combat Darkseid during this entire JLA run. yet again cementing the fact that he's not the primary enemy of the Justice League. But let's move on a little bit. Not too far after the JLA comes to a close, the next universe-altering event takes place, and that's Infinite Crisis. This is a follow-up to the Crisis on Infinite Earths of like 20 years before. At the end of that arc, two Supermen and Lois went with Alex Luthor of Earth 3 to what was claimed to be this like everlasting peace. This is right before the universe was rebooted. What happened to them is almost never touched on up until the Infinite Crisis. This story deals with the heroes of the universe making some questionable moral decisions, and the world seems to be descending into chaos. As an example, Blue Beetle gets killed by Max Lord as he uncovers this plan to make the Omax, which are basically evil cyborgs. So Max Lord kills him. Then on camera, Wonder Woman up and kills Max Lord, expressing that she had to do it. This turns into a big argument between Wonder Woman, Superman, and Batman. Something is clearly going on that even the Guardians are finding some imbalance with this universe. But we find out what happened to those two Supermen, Lois and Alex Luthor. They had been sitting in this dimension the entire time watching Earth. They think the world needs a saving now, and they decide to break out of this dimension. And by the end of the first issue, well, they're out. They link up with Power Girl, who had been on Earth this entire time, but she doesn't remember the events of the Crisis on Infinite Earths. So they explain it to her. We also find that Lois Lane of Earth 2, if I'm not mistaken, is dying, and when she touches Power Girl, for some reason, she remembers who she is. Power Girl, that is. So after the end of the second issue, they basically believe that the wrong Earth was saved, and they must do something about it. Because Batman right now, remember that argument? He's going through it. So they try to reel him in, and they tell him of the experience of the Batman of Earth 2. His life's just way better. But Batman rejects this offer, and he's worried that they have the power to seemingly wipe out the entire planet. But soon enough, we find out that Alexander Luthor and Superboy Prime, that second Superman, they have their own agenda. After capturing Power Girl as well as Martian Manhunter, Alexander Luthor explains that while Superman was taking care of Lois, that's Earth 2 Superman, Superboy Prime, which is the second Superman, and Alexander Luthor were devising a second plan. When they got out of that dimension, or heaven as they call it, they went to retrieve the Anti-Monitor's corpse to build a machine. Remember, the Anti-Monitor is the main enemy in the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, Alexander manipulated the society of villains to basically collect people that would power said machine. The machine was what would be used to find a new perfect Earth. So much of the conflicts and the turmoil that's happening on this Earth, it was caused by Alexander Luthor. Let's try to speed this up a little. Now, in a conflict with Superboy Prime and some of the Titans, we briefly see one of Barry Allen's rare post-crisis appearances when he was in the Speed Force, and he seems to bring Superboy Prime into it. So we are starting to see some members of that second Earth, such as Wonder Woman, who convinces Earth 1 Wonder Woman to help Superman, who is fighting Earth 2 Superman, because Lois ends up dying anyway. And of course, this makes that Superman mad enough to blame Earth 1. Alexander Luthor knew she wasn't going to survive. He just never told that Superman. Quick recap, Alexander is trying to basically recreate the multiverse, and he has a tower of heroes and villains from multiple Earths powering it to help him find the perfect Earth that he'll allow to exist. So Earths are now basically exploding in the sky, and we have a big war between heroes and Alexander Luthor and Superboy Prime, who made it back from the Speed Force. Now, in a big battle which resulted in the explosion of the Speed Force, Superboy from Earth 1 dies. This is Connor Kent's Superboy, for those keeping track, which is the clone that was created by Lex Luthor. So it looks like yet again we have another remerging of the Earth's situation. But Alexander Luthor is defeated. Unfortunately, with this battle, Earth 2 Superman does die. And Lex Luthor and Joker seem to end up killing Alexander Luthor. The one important thing to take from all of this is that the Earths have merged back and Superboy Prime is still alive, though being held prisoner by the Green Lantern Corps in the center of the universe. So we're up to 2006 and we have ourselves a reboot of Justice League in Justice League of America. In issue 0, it alludes to the idea that Superman and Batman were also part of the fight with the Apolexians, which led to the creation of the Justice League. Remember, they seem to retcon that part of the original origin story out, and thankfully with this book, they put it back in. We get to see some of the other historical events, such as the death of Superman being mentioned. But Wonder Woman, Superman, and Batman are getting the League back together, deciding who to invite to the team. The first official team consists of the Big Three: Vixen, Speedy, Hawkgirl, Black Canary, Hal Jordan's Green Lantern, Red Tornado, and Black Lightning. A cool point that most don't know is that Cyborg, he was one of the invited people, or rather heroes, to join, but he wasn't actually contacted. You need to understand that the Cyborg addition to the Justice League is a relatively new thing. His squad, as you should know, was always the Titans historically. They fought some cool villains, and this run went all the way through 2011. I'm not going to speak much or reference it because most of the characters that come and go we've already discussed. There's also no New Gods appearances or Darkseid in this run. One point though that we for sure want to mention is the fact that Aquaman and Martian Manhunter for the most part don't really appear in this run of the Justice League. But I don't want to move up until 2011 quite yet. Let's get back to the New Gods. In 2007, the great Jim Sterling, man, he knows how to write this like cosmic sort of book. They brought him in, DC brought him in to write this book known as The Death of the New Gods. In this book, many New Gods are being either killed off or they're missing. Orion, of course, believes that it's Darkseid, but there isn't much proof of that. One thing to note here is that Orion in this artwork has grown like a foot and he's hulked up. But Darkseid has decided, looking into like what's going on, all these New Gods are dying because his allies are dying too. Now they're trying to reel in Superman, the other New Gods, the New Genesis New Gods, and we see this cool fight with Orion and both Superman. Now, if anything that's cool that's worth noting is that Orion and Superman basically fight at a standstill. Metron shows up and confirms that Darkseid is not, however, responsible. But whoever is killing them off has created a second wall that looks like the source wall, only it's a trophy wall of whoever the killer is. So you're seeing some of those dead New Gods. The Darkseid says that the person killing them cannot be stopped. But many notable New Gods, including Orion, are unfortunately killed off. The killer turns out to be the Infinity Man, who was posing as Hyman, one of the other New Gods. Now, Infinity Man is the brother of Darkseid, actually. Now, the Infinity Man was working with the Source itself, so we learned what this whole Source phenomena is. And as it turns out, he's just the opposite of the anti-life, and eventually they do merge. Then, well, they end up killing Mr. Miracle and Metron. This was a very dark story. The Source is looking to recreate yet another world, which will be known as, well, the Fifth World. The last person, though, he has to deal with, of course, is none other than Darkseid, who had been devising a plan for this very moment. The Source and Darkseid duke it out before Superman decides to enter the fight, but he's knocked out by Darkseid. This is where we find the Source's one precautionary measure was salvaging the soul of Orion, who ends up fighting Darkseid. The Source's plans do succeed, and Apocalypse and New Genesis merges, and all of the New Gods, as we know them, are dead. The only person that seemed to get out of Dodge was Darkseid. As awesome as the Death of the New Gods run could have been, it was rendered pointless almost immediately because a book called Countdown made the story convoluted, or rather it just didn't make much sense. They tried to position it in a way in which Countdown popped off the events for the death of the New Gods. For example, Countdown issue 48 deals with the death of Light Ray. By the way, Countdown's issues literally Countdown, unlike other comics, so issue 1 was actually the last issue of Countdown. And as mentioned, in the death of the New Gods, Darkseid was up to his own plans while the others were trying to solve this mystery. One of those plans apparently was all of what happened really in Countdown, which is him basically moving the DC universe on a cosmic chessboard of sort. So he's influencing the events going on in Countdown, which is him seemingly moving the fifth world to Earth. When you consider what happened in Jim Starlin's book, this makes no sense whatsoever. Orion even kills Darkseid in a Countdown book. At the end of Countdown, a book called DC Universe issue number 0 was released with a narrator trying to make sense of all that is going on. In the beginning, he explains what happened in the original Crisis and Infinite Crisis, and now we are at the final Crisis, and apparently there was a war in heaven. That narrator turned out to be none other than Barry Allen. Though we just had a crisis right after the events of the death of the New Gods, we go into yet another crisis, final crisis. It is a convoluted mess of a story, so while Darkseid is technically in this book clashing with the Justice League, it's like a fake Darkseid, part of a terrible story. This run wasted a solid end of the New Gods in Jim Starlin's book, of course. It also highlights the major emphasis on the return of the multiverses and monitors, resulting in plenty of tokenized Superman. But the iconic part of the beginning of this book is the return of Barry Allen. The story itself isn't even worth talking about and makes no sense in the context of what happened at the end of the deaths of the New Gods. But Darkseid is the center of it all and does clash with members of the Justice League. It's just a rather fake Darkseid. Long story short, Darkseid possessed another person on Earth only to lose by the end of the final crisis. The story was trash and it signified DC's lack of leadership, as well as going back to making those same mistakes they did prior to the original crisis with its multiverses and other concepts. You may think I'm being harsh, but trust me, the world gets rebooted in 3 years anyway. It's simply not important. Just know Barry Allen Flash is back. Now, DC had an incredibly rough run from Final Crisis up until Rebirth, which that goes all the way through 2016. Let's fast forward though to 2011 before we get to 2016. An event called Flashpoint pops off. This is a story centered around Barry Allen going back in time as he wanted to save his parents from dying. Doing so creates a ripple effect that wakes him up in a completely different world, such as Thomas Wayne, which is Bruce Wayne's father. He became Batman. DC Comics did an animated movie called Flashpoint Paradoxes, if I'm not mistaken, and it's almost a direct depiction of what happened. Now, after some conflict with Reverse Flash, he concedes he has to change it back, the world that is, and they think it's normal, but it's not. This launches the era known as the New 52. I've been on record stating that this is by far the worst era of DC Comics, and it's not even close. Well, maybe close to what they're releasing these days. The entire universe is rebooted, and you have these needless changes to basically every single character, to the point to where many of them aren't even recognizable. Their relationships aren't the same. It's just all a mess. Every bit of continuity has been scrapped, and what is considered canon, well, there isn't really none. They get to make it up along the way, and sometimes they will pull from the past, but the idea is that you really don't know. It turns DC Comics into a big free-for-all where they get to make it up along the way. Some people will make excuses for this era, saying that, well, some of the stories were okay. None of that matters if it can't fit within the realm of the established lore. What makes DC great isn't just a cool story. It's the fact that the characters fit within this larger universe, and they have established histories that, of course, run together. It's as if DC didn't want their writers having to fit within these confines of those characters having those histories existing for really decades. So they wanted to capitalize on the names while being able to do whatever they wanted. The point of the original Crisis on Infinite Earths was to streamline and simplify so that characters have one consistent history, mostly made up of things that had already happened. The point of the New 52, though, was to completely ditch those histories for the most part. So imagine being a fan for decades, right? And then out of nowhere, DC says that all of those classic stories, they really don't even matter anymore. Either way, we have to talk about it just in the context of the DC extended universe, what you watch in the movies. Unfortunately, they drew a lot of influence from this era. Let's first talk about the Justice League. Now, in the New 52 reboot of the Justice League, the characters don't even really know each other. Barry Allen's Flash doesn't know Batman even has powers. Batman and Hal Jordan, Green Lantern, they end up stumbling across a mother box, and Superman shows up saying someone showed up in his town with one of them and they blew up a building, right? Flash then shows up and the three briefly duke it out with Superman until cooler heads prevail. They are trying to figure out the source of these mother boxes. Now, Cyborg is in this book as well as a football player that is upset at his father because he's not coming to his football games. He's at Star Labs working on one of those mother boxes, and of course it ends up blowing up, and in order to save him, his father utilizes some of the experimental tech, a lot of which is alien, which turns him into Cyborg. So this version of Cyborg is connected to some apocalypse tech, which is not what originally happened, but it looks as if the minions of Darkseid right now are attacking the Earth. Wonder Woman then shows up out of nowhere. They don't know who she is. Aquaman appears. They thought he was a myth. He appeared just out of nowhere. So as you can obviously tell, this bunch is going to be the new Justice League, and Darkseid is going to be the new enemy. As you see, all of this is, for the most part, ahistorical. Darkseid was never the big enemy of the Justice League. Certainly when they were first becoming a thing, nor was Cyborg seen as this original member of the Justice League. This embodies what the New 52 was, doing what really didn't have to make sense. The excuse was always that this would make it more accessible to the readers, refresh things, which is always a bad argument considering that that's what omnibuses are specifically for. You do not have to destroy the legacy of the characters and render previous lore completely irrelevant just for the sake of bringing in a new audience. Anyway, the first issues of Justice League is just an excuse to really speed run through their origin stories that are explained along the way. So the big clash between the Justice League and Darkseid is a very recent thing in the context of the Justice League's long history. This take on Darkseid has him with his boots on the ground immediately though, fighting the Justice League, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, but the conflict with him is what leads to their creation, which, to be fair, does have most of the original members of the Justice League. It's just no Martian Manhunter. It doesn't end with Darkseid's defeat either. It's just that Darkseid's forces are transported back to where they came from, and the mother boxes are all fried. So mother boxes are being used to boom tube in and out of dimensions, is at least kept intact. But this book is a damn mess, and it's largely influential, unfortunately, to what you see in the DC Extended Universe, as this is where, again, they got much of their information from. You see the Shazam movie, it's almost a direct replica of what happened in the New 52. That's where that material came from. But because this is a free-for-all, characters such as Superman don't even act like Superman, and the interactions between one another make no sense in the context of the history of the Justice League. Even the multiversal issues are back. So my frustrations aside though, let's keep it in the context of, again, the DC Extended Universe. Darkseid returns around issue 23, actually. They call it issue 23.1, which was technically a Justice League book, but they have Darkseid over it. And that serves as a bit of an origin story for this version of Darkseid, albeit a stupid one. In this one, the old gods aren't just the gods before the new gods. In this one, they exist as just regular gods with people like Darkseid and Isaiah, which is the real name of the High Father. They're just simply mortals. So when the old gods go to war, Darkseid already exists. In this rendition, Avia is still the wife of the High Father, but now she's the sister of Darkseid. And they don't get their powers now in a more evolutionary way. They now get it either when they kill an old god or they give them their powers. Now Darkseid does the former, so he takes his power. Isaiah does the latter, and his powers are given to him as a gift from a dying old god. And Apocalypse ends up being created out of Darkseid and really just destroying their world out of frustration. It sounds ridiculous because it is. It's a complete deviation from what originally happened with the New Gods, and this previous lore has been abandoned. Darkseid's involved in a bunch of multiple Earth bullcrap for a couple of years, which reintroduces some of the New Gods, but his next big clash during what is known as the Darkseid War is with the Justice League, and that starts in issue 40. The idea is that after the events of those first issues of this run of Justice League, he's been planning his return to Earth. Metron appears randomly in his classic Mobius chair at the beginning of this arc. He says that the two of the most powerful and evil beings will have a war, and that's about to erupt. If he doesn't stop it, history will then unravel, and they may not be able to put this reality back together as they have done many times in the past. He's a keeper of knowledge right now, and usually he doesn't interfere unless something catastrophic is about to happen. He's almost in a position such as Uatu, the Watcher in Marvel Universe. One of those times that he did get involved was when he was talking to both the High Father and Darkseid, and he talked them into exchanging both scot-free, Mr. Miracle, and Orion as a sort of peace offering. So the exchange of the two kids still happens in the New 52. It's just this time it was under the influence of Metron. He also notes the recent universe-altering events such as the Crisis on Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, and the recent Flashpoint, which we are now in. Added now, however, is the fact that Metron's Mobius chair is now named after the Anti-Monitor, as Mobius is his real name. So Metron's chair isn't his own creation. Metron says he sees the end of reality permanently if the Anti-Monitor continues to try to destroy, and it will be with a conflict between him and Darkseid. But this is something the Anti-Monitor actually welcomes. This story briefly continues in a one-shot called Divergence, where we learn that Darkseid had a child with an Amazonian woman. The child's name is Grail, and the mother is Marina Black. Moving on to the start of the Darkseid War. By now, Mr. Miracle has reappeared, understanding that what is about to come, look, he needs the assistance of the Justice League. One thing you'll learn about the New 52 is the advancement of the mother boxes. They are a big time focus in terms of what's going on. Rather, historically, they were important, definitely when it came to booming in and out the dimensions, but just not the central item that it is now. And the beginning parts of this war, of course, deals with the reintroduction of some of Darkseid's elites, but they look different. For example, Steppenwolf looks far more human, and he has this beard, whereas the Darkseid looks, well, less human. Anyway, the Anti-Monitor appears on Earth, and he's deployed Grail to bring Darkseid to him. Marina reveals that it was her that sent her daughter to find someone that was strong enough to kill Darkseid. So they purposely are bringing this war to Earth, and this angers Mr. Miracle because he knows that billions are going to have to die. Metron has transported the Justice League members out of harm's way to let them in on what's going on. He tells them to get off Earth as they can't stop the Anti-Monitor. Wonder Woman pulls him from the Mobius chair because she wants real answers. But it seems like it is about to boom out of the area, and Batman grabs it. Then he sits in the chair and he starts to ask questions such as, what's the Joker's real name? That of which he says isn't even possible. Then you can see his attitude changes, and they say he's a god now. The only thing that the chair doesn't answer is who the Anti-Monitor actually is. Either way, he's this weird bat god now, and a war's brewing, and Superman and Lex Luthor are actually on Apocalypse. Darkseid finally appears back on Earth, and here we go, Darkseid versus the Anti-Monitor. And the heroes of Earth have absolutely no idea who the lesser of the evil actually is. Now, Calibuck and Grail are fighting opposite sides, of course. They're brother and sister. We have ourselves a battle, and on Apocalypse, because there's no sunlight, Superman is losing his powers. So Luthor tosses him into the pits, which are powered by solar energy. Superman comes out in his sort of black and white form, and he's clearly not the same person. Now this Bat God, Batman, and Green Lantern are searching for answers, and you can see that this is playing out on Earth. It turns out that Mobius, aka the Anti-Monitor, is also the living embodiment of anti-life equation, which Darkseid he's always been after. And using the Black Racer, who used the Flash, it seems that Darkseid is defeated by Mobius. Now Flash is basically Black Racer, thus making him the god of death. After the defeat of Darkseid, everybody seems to disappear and the war looks to be over. Meanwhile, on Apokolips, crazy Superman leaves Luthor on that planet, and the Forgotten People discover him. Forgotten People was a book way back in the day that introduced a lot of us to the new gods. Anyway, a blind prophet once said that a human would appear after the defeat of Darkseid, and they think it's Luthor. Luthor says that it has to be him. They say after Darkseid died, the source of his power would return and the human would contain it. So when you hear the way that they're talking about it, it makes it seem as if that human was supposed to be Superman. Nevertheless, Luthor, he consumes that power and he becomes the god of Apokolips. So right now you have a bunch of versions of these characters that are running around that are like gods. This ridiculous list includes Batman, who is now the god of knowledge because he's in that Mobius chair, Superman, who is now the god of strength, Shazam, who's the god of gods, the Flash, who's the god of death, and the Green Lantern is the god of light. And of course, we still have the problem with the Anti-Monitor, and some of the heroes are on Earth fighting with even Darkseid's minions. Now, Big Barda even appears to help and assist. Possessed Superman finally makes it on Earth and dukes it out with Wonder Woman, while Grail ends up getting hold of the anti-life, thus becoming the goddess of anti-life. Bat God, with all of his knowledge because of the chair, understands that Superman is actually dying. Either way, the crime syndicate, yes, they brought them back, had been jailed, and now everybody understands that they are going to have to work together in order to beat the Anti-Monitor, who of course wants his chair back. Lex then arrives, and now he's fighting the Anti-Monitor. And who of all people defeats the Anti-Monitor? Steve Trevor, after being possessed or infused with Grail's new power. Now Steve is fighting Wonder Woman, and this story is just getting more and more ridiculous. Just know that the characters are starting to rid themselves of these new powers that they got, godlike powers. And before you knew it, Darkseid is brought back to life because Superwoman of the crime syndicate had a baby, and they were able to use that baby to then become Darkseid. It sounds incredibly silly because it is. So there's just a ridiculous war going on between all of these characters that are involved. It ends up with Grail shooting at Darkseid and seeming to kill her mother, Myra Black, in the process. Apparently, it doesn't actually kill Darkseid, it just turns him back into that child. So now Grail, his daughter, looks like she's going to be the one raising baby Darkseid. Look, man, this story was ridiculous and this era was ridiculous. Thankfully, by the end of the Justice League, DC understood that the New 52 was a god-awful mistake, and they sought to reboot the universe with an event called Rebirth. There was an event right before that called Convergence that dealt with sort of restoring these multiverses, but the main event that leads us into the modern era of DC Comics is Rebirth. I want to reiterate that you have to understand that the issue with the New 52 was not simply the stories isolated. This is why you hear so many people say, but this arc was okay. I like the Court of Owls. I like this story in Batman. That's not the problem, though I dispute that the stories, even themselves, they really weren't that good, but that's neither here nor there. The problem was that they basically erased all of what happened to these characters prior to 2011 as they were these newer reiterations. Convergence going into Rebirth allowed them to correct this mistake and bring back aspects of these characters that we've known and understood for decades. Rebirth hits the ground running immediately with addressing the problem by bringing back Wally West, whose existence was basically erased, though they tried to bring in this black one in the New 52. After the defeat of Darkseid, reality sort of flickered, giving Wally West the opening back into this universe, and the first person he meets up with is Batman because he figures he's the one that's going to understand all of this. But he keeps getting pulled back into the Speed Force. We take a trip down memory lane, going through the classic moments that define Wally West, even mentioning his feelings when Barry Allen, that Flash, sacrificed himself in the original Crisis on Infinite Earths. He then touches on the events of Flashpoint and how that new reality took like 10 years away. But the most important line to me is Wally describing the events after Flashpoint as, and I'm quoting right here, "Heroes that were legends became novices. Bonds between them were weakened and erased. Legacies were destroyed." As far as I'm concerned, that's DC Comics conceding exactly the problem with the New 52, and they wanted the reader to know that they were sorry. But Wally says that the secret is that someone else, aside from the actual Flashpoint, changed the universe. Wally then meets up with Johnny Thunder, who is old as hell, and Wally tells him to go find the Justice Society of America. Then Wally is pulled back into the Speed Force. Wally is seeing how the universe played out and sees things like Black Canary and Green Arrow not even knowing each other. Things really get weird when he sees Linda, who is his wife, but unfortunately he doesn't know who exactly he is. We see the Black Wally West, and they explain his existence and being the cousin of the real Wally, and he just didn't even know much about him because of his uncle Daniel. He wasn't that close to him. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but whatever. They just wanted to make an excuse to keep the Black Wally West around, though reintroducing the original Wally. But the big moment is when he finds Barry Allen. He expects him not to know who he is, and he just wants to tell Batman that history is all jacked up. He's conceding, and he's just going to fall back into the Speed Force. But before he officially goes in, he gets pulled back into this reality by Barry, and one of the most powerful recent moments in DC Comics recent history, that is, happens when Barry hugs him. And to Wally's surprise, he knows exactly who he is. Wally tells him it wasn't actually the Flashpoint that messed everything up, and this story continues on and is really connected to the whole Doomsday Clock event. It revealed that the outside source was Dr. Manhattan. The primary thing to note for the sake of this video is that these events allowed DC to reattach established legacy to these characters going forward. Now, after Rebirth and the Justice League, No Justice that is, there are 3 different Justice League books. Some of those are continuing right now. There's the regular Justice League Odyssey, as well as Justice League Dark. We've been covering that on this channel, but I'm not going to go into those because they are very recent, and there's almost no way that the Justice League movie could have drawn influence from those if we are considering the fact that that movie is based on what happened prior to 2017. But most of these characters have histories that are older than many of your parents, and I'd be spending another 3 hours if I broke down the history of each individual character in the Justice League. But there are historical points we can jump through that are a little bit referenced in this movie. Justice League picks up obviously after Batman v Superman. That basically combines the main ideas of The Dark Knight Returns and the death of Superman. The former, though it wasn't really canon, influences the fight itself, and the latter has more to do with the ending of that movie. This isn't supposed to be a review of Batman v Superman, but I want to give you some historical reference considering it sets the scene for what's going to happen in the Justice League movie. At the end of that movie, Batman v Superman, you know Superman sacrifices himself to kill Doomsday. This did happen in the comics, just the movie does it in a different way. Lex had nothing to do with the original death of Superman arc in terms of bringing about Doomsday. So it's like the DC Extended Universe just mixed up a bunch of arcs. The thing I don't understand about this, however, is how much the DCEU dropped the ball here. There is historical reference with Luthor, Darkseid, and Doomsday. There's an arc called Rematch Hunter Prey, where Doomsday defeats Darkseid on his own planet. letting you know how strong Doomsday actually is. And Superman only defeats Doomsday after he basically becomes one with this mother box as it turns into this like special like armor. In the early 2000s, there's also an arc that involves Luthor, Superman, and Doomsday in the Superman book at the time. Luthor resurrects Doomsday. Doomsday fights Superman, and in that arc, Superman beats him instead of them just fighting basically to a standstill, and they both die as they did in the original Death of Superman. Now, this arc ended with Lex giving Doomsday to Darkseid. I personally think this is an example of comic book movies just trying to do too much, rushing the introduction of these characters, and that's why, though the DCEU tried to make nods to the comic books earlier on, it kind of made a lot of people feel uneasy. But let's backtrack just a little bit. What happened after Superman died in the Death of Superman? Between time, you did have super folk on Earth, such as Steel, you had Supergirl, Superboy, Cyborg, Superman, the latter of which fought the others. But Superman gets brought back by someone, or rather something, known as the Eradicator after it stole his body from this tomb. His idea was just to get power from that body because it sensed Superman's soul was still active, but the fortress he places him in ends up bringing him back to life, and this is where you see him re-emerge with this black suit that you see in the Justice League movie. There's also another story that I want to mention in the context of the Justice League movie. In the mid-90s, Wonder Woman, there's actually an arc called Second Genesis in which she has this conflict with Darkseid. He briefly invades Earth and takes Wonder Woman hostage. Now Metron, being the knowledge base that he is, tells her that most of what she knows is a lie. He tells her the story of how Apocalypse and New Genesis are created, but what he adds is that from that Ragnarok, power went to different directions in the universe, part of which hit Earth, and this resulted in the gods of Olympus. This is why Darkseid is interested in Wonder Woman. The gods that they've been worshiping were created by the same force that created the new gods. A battle ensued there, and unfortunately it ended up in the deaths of many Amazonians. Look, I could keep going on and on and on about the individual characters, their conflicts with Darkseid. You saw a lot with Superman. Some on the side that I didn't mention that dealt with, let's say, some of the Justice League members fighting Darkseid. I didn't touch on that little Godhead stuff either. Look, if I did that, this video will be even longer, and maybe I'll do some stuff that covers that in future videos. But I think I got most, if not all, of the main important parts when it comes to the history of the Justice League itself, as well as Darkseid and some of the new gods. I may do a video, like I said, talking about some other stuff in the future. This history extends deep, man. But now that you know at least the main history of Justice League, and you got that important information with the new gods, let's talk about the movie itself. Justice League starts with recapping the events of Batman v Superman. Of course, Superman is dead, but what we are now seeing is the emphasis being placed on these mother boxes. And these mother boxes are in different areas throughout the universe, specifically in settings of the other characters. One thing I do appreciate about this movie is how it breaks the story up into different arcs as if it's a comic book. Part 1 is called Don't Count on It, Batman. Remember, by the end of Batman v Superman, we know that Batman is trying to find other like metahumans to build a team around. The first he's looking for is Aquaman, which is kind of weird because he's just talking as Bruce and tells him immediately he's Batman, and they are speaking loudly among the villagers. Now, Aquaman seems to reject his offer initially as he goes into the seas. After a scene with Lois Lane, we then move on. Just doing a bit of reminiscing. We have ourselves a bank robbery also in place in London. A pretty cutthroat one too, considering they're killing people right off the rip. Head honcho plants a bomb, and this is when Wonder Woman shows up, wrapping the lasso of truth around one of the terrorists. The terrorist reveals that they aren't even here to make demands. They just wanted to stall so they could set a bomb. This fight scene though with Wonder Woman is awesome. Look, when you understand just how powerful some of these characters are, some fight scenes don't often make sense in live action settings. This one does a solid job of capturing the difference between Wonder Woman and just regular people, as she's one-punching people across the room and she's leg sweeping folks into walls. But as it's counting down that bomb that was planted, Wonder Woman grabs the bomb, flies up in the air, and chucks it into the sky. We move on to Themyscira with the Amazons, where they are surrounding this mother box that has awakened. They acknowledge that it has been there for thousands of years. The mother box sort of blows up, and obviously it's a boom tube, as Parademons and Steppenwolf finally show up. The Parademons duke it out with the Amazons, and many of them die trying to keep this mother box away from Steppenwolf, who is entirely stronger than everyone there. Unfortunately, he booms out of Themyscira with the mother box, so he has one of three. Part 3 is called The Age of Heroes. We start with Steppenwolf sending the Parademons to get the other two mother boxes, mentioning that he will be pleased once he gets them. We move on to Star Labs, where we see Cyborg's Pop on his way out. A janitor then discovers a Parademon, and that doesn't end well for him. The Queen of Themyscira sends her warning shot into the shrine of the Amazons to warn her daughter, who is of course Wonder Woman, before we get back though to that situation back at Star Labs. Now, Cyborg's dad warns him that monsters came looking for this mother box that he has. And going back to Wonder Woman, she's received this message, and she's going down further into this shrine, where she looks at the wall, and ingrained in that wall, it seems to look as if it's Darkseid. Now, down in Atlantis, we see Aquaman still reluctant to accept being a king of Atlantis. Voko says he needs to do something because people are coming for the mother box. The next scene deals with Steppenwolf talking to Darkseid. We get some more backstory as far as what's going on. It's as if Steppenwolf is trying to collect these mother boxes in order to show that he is worthy to Darkseid, as he's in some sort of debt to him. Now, Darkseid says Darkseid will hear Steppenwolf's plea when he pays his debt. The cool thing about this conversation is that Steppenwolf mentions the lanterns, referencing that there are none on Earth that can stop him. Then we get back to Wonder Woman linking up with Bruce Wayne, telling him that the invaders that he feared would eventually come, look, they're already here. She then tells him a story of Darkseid's first invasion on Earth, which was long ago. It included the old gods such as Zeus and Ares, Atlanteans before they went to sea, Amazons, and Guardians from the stars, which is obviously referencing Green Lanterns. And this is where we get our actual first look at Darkseid. Wonder Woman continues to explain that when three mother boxes are together, they make the Unity, and it turns the planet into the home planet of whoever made it. And then the people that live become parademons. So we get a pretty sick scene of this war. This really gives the audience perspective as to what they are trying to capture with Darkseid, but also notes the fact that because they fought together, they were the only world that sent them packing, stopping the unity of the mother boxes. But when Darkseid's forces retreated, the mother boxes, they remained on Earth. So man, Amazons, and the Atlanteans vowed to guard them, which is a pretty sick story. Moving on to part 3. I think I said part 3 last time, but this was actually part 3. It's called Beloved Mother, Beloved Son. We start with Barry Allen, who locks eyes with Iris West on his way to what seems to be an interview with a dog care center or like pet store of sorts. Iris gets into a wreck with a truck, and this is where we see Barry first using his powers as she's flying through the air. He saves her. This little slow song is starting to play. This scene is an awesome display of his powers, but it's cheesy as hell. Back to Steppenwolf. He's trying to attack the Atlanteans now, trying to find one of those mother boxes, and he seems to figure out where one of them is by using some like alien tech, which searches his mind. And back to Wonder Woman and Bruce Wayne, they decide to split up. They're gonna attempt to recruit both Cyborg and Barry Allen to this new team. Now we get a bit of backstory on Cyborg as he's playing football, and we get some slow-mo action making a game-winning play, only for him to see his mother, not his father. As they discuss his father in this like car ride back, they get into a wreck. So we got back-to-back car wrecks here. Cyborg's mom, unfortunately, is killed, and Cyborg is on life support with missing arms and no lower body. This is where we get our first full look at Cyborg trying to figure out what all his body can do while listening to this recorded tape of his father who's explaining it all. This was an effort to cheer him up, but it also gives the audience an idea of what he can do. The movie then takes us back to Barry Allen, who is speaking to his father, who's in prison. Of course, it's due to the murder that he didn't commit when it comes to his mother. Now, Barry tells him of his aspirations in being in criminal justice to save his father, but his father tells him he needs to stop, give that up, and go be something else. We move on to Barry Allen going then to his little hideout, only to find Bruce Wayne sitting in there waiting for him. This is where you see the part where Bruce throws like a batarang and Flash catches it and realizes Bruce is Batman. This was an easy recruit because Batman didn't have to really even make a pitch. He said, "I'm in." And Wonder Woman then meets up with Cyborg, who he's burying this mother box at his own grave with his mother. Victor's father is abducted then by parademons, and Steppenwolf heads to Atlantis to get the other mother box. Now Mira is there to fight with him before Aquaman shows up, and we get that cool underwater fight scene, and it takes place. But unfortunately, Steppenwolf wins, and he successfully gets that mother box. Part 4 is called Changing Machine, and it starts with Detective Gordon meeting with Batman, but he's joined by Flash and Wonder Woman. Mid-conversation, as they piece together what's going on, Cyborg then shows up, and now we have a team of 4. They head to Steppenwolf's whereabouts, where he's interrogating people, trying to find that last box. And we have ourselves another showdown in which we get to see our heroes doing their thing. The battle then ends with Steppenwolf booming up out of there, then Aquaman shows up. Steppenwolf then summons Darkseid to tell him that the anti-life equation is carved into Earth. Then Darkseid shows up and says that he will come to Earth once Steppenwolf creates the Unity. Back to the Justice League, where Cyborg is telling the story of 3 mother boxes. Somehow the Nazis are involved. They had to mention the Nazis, of course. And they had the box at one point, up until it ended up in the hands of Cyborg's dad, who harnessed that power of the mother box to keep Cyborg alive after the accident. Considering how the mother box works, they get the idea to try to use it to revive Superman. The next part is a conversation between Lois and Martha Kent about getting on with their lives, but we find out that Martha wasn't actually Martha. That was Martian Manhunter, who had shapeshifted. In this conversation between League members, we get more insight on the mother boxes and the history on Earth. Why they had called out before, but nobody ever showed up like Steppenwolf. It was because, or rather they figure out, that they were scared of Superman. So now they're showing up because, well, he's dead. Part 5 is called All the King's Horses, and they are digging up Superman's grave. Flash asks Cyborg if Wonder Woman would go for a younger guy like him, and Cyborg says, dude, she's over 5,000 years old. Everybody is younger than her. They then take the body to Star Labs because they have possession of Superman's ship, which they're going to use to help them. Now Flash uses his power to help wake the mother box, that of which the ship is advising against because it knows Steppenwolf will come for it. We get this scene that looks like a glimpse of the future, with Darkseid having basically won and Superman seems to be helping him. They proceed anyway, but it worked and Superman is back alive. This is where Cyborg's body goes into that defense mode and Superman starts fighting him. And that's the whole scene, that cool scene between Flash and Superman, which shows just how fast Superman is. Though he's not faster than Flash, he can at least make a move. Now Clark doesn't stop attacking the others until he sees Lois, which makes him remember who he was. He takes off with Lois, but then Steppenwolf shows up. Cyborg dad, he heats that mother box. He took the mother box, he heats it, and unfortunately, in doing that, he kills himself. And Steppenwolf, he still takes off with the mother box. But that wasn't the point. He didn't sacrifice himself just to sacrifice himself. He wanted the heroes to be able to find this. That way the heroes could then know where that box is, because using thermal views and what have you, they know where the box is and they can go to his hideout, that is Steppenwolf's. Part 6 is called Something Darker, and we are back to Superman and Lois. Superman is slowly but surely starting to remember who he is. The Justice League right now are also preparing their attack on Steppenwolf's base. Bruce mentions the dream that he had back in the Gap, which was in Batman v Superman, and Flash showed up saying Lewis was the key. He thinks there's something more to that. But Steppenwolf has started the Unity now, and then we see Superman emerge, right, with his black suit, and the others arrive near Steppenwolf's base. Batman sort of takes down the defenses and starts fighting these parademons. There are so many cool scenes of Aquaman and Batman fighting here. Aquaman, Cyborg, and Wonder Woman, they start fighting Steppenwolf. That was pretty cool. But Cyborg taps into those mother boxes, and Flash is waiting on his command, because that's the whole point. He's trying to send this charge. But Steppenwolf looks like he's about to strike Cyborg before he can. And then Superman shows up. He takes the strike right to that shoulder, and he doesn't even budge. And this fight between him and Steppenwolf shows just how strong Superman is, because Steppenwolf doesn't even stand a chance. But just as we think Steppenwolf is about to be defeated, Darkseid shows up. It's like he's about to boom into Earth. So we're at least looking into Apocalypse right now. But at first, it looks like they failed to stop the Unity. This is where we get that scene where Flash is sort of running back in time quickly so that he can get to the mother boxes in time and help Cyborg out. So this time they're successful. They destroy the mother boxes, and Aquaman stabs Steppenwolf with the trident. Superman hits him, and then Wonder Woman chops his head off. Kind of feel a little weird about that. Anyway, Steppenwolf then returns to Darkseid through the boom tube with his head removed from his body. And the tube closes, and this is where we get our first live look at Darkseid and some of the others on Apocalypse. There's another character that I'm guessing has to be Granny Goodness, because it looks like an older woman. And Darkseid tells Darkseid to ready the Armada, as they are going to go about this the old way. His interest in the anti-life equation, and his interest is the anti-life equation, and he's like, nothing's gonna stop me. The last part is the epilogue, and Cyborg is listening to the tape of his father. Aquaman is about to go see his father. Ryan Choi becomes the director in terms of Star Labs. Bruce, Alfred, and Wonder Woman are scouting what will be the base of the Justice League. Barry tells his father that he's got a real job now at a crime lab. Bruce Wayne helps get the Kent's farm back. Of course, he's rich. We see Cyborg visiting his parents' graves and such. All sorts of stuff's going on right now. But they're just making their way around the characters. Then we head to Arkham Asylum, and it gets pretty weird because we see the back of Lex Luthor's head, or we thought that was him, but it wasn't. It's someone else that was in his cell. So it looks like he escaped. That's immediately confirmed as he's sitting on a boat when Deathstroke of all people appears. Luthor tells Deathstroke that Batman is Bruce. We then see Batman, Cyborg, Mira, and Flash on a mission of sorts. They're speaking as if something happened to Aquaman, and Mira says she's gonna stab someone in the chest. Now, Mira asks Batman who he's ever loved, as if he doesn't understand. And then Joker says Batman knows exactly what it's like to lose a mother, a father, and an adoptive son. This is obviously in reference to the death of Jason Todd, who was Robin. They reference the death of Lois Lane, which seems to have created this world that they're living in. It seems to look like the one that Cyborg saw, that future earlier, and members of the Justice League and even someone like the Suicide Squad, because Deathstroke's there, they're working together. But it was all a dream, and then Bruce wakes up. And this is where we get a cool scene of Martian Manhunter telling Batman that he wants in. Darkseid isn't done. We know a war is gonna come, and he wants in. And that's really the end of the movie. Now you know what happened in Snyder Cut's version of the Justice League. What are my thoughts on the movie itself? I want to preface this by saying this yet again. I have zero allegiances when it comes to Marvel or DC. I know others have this extreme bias to one or the other, and it clearly gets in the way of how they analyze the material. They'll hate everything DC, love everything DC, and the same applies to Marvel. But no such bias exists for me, as I grew up a fan of both of those brands. I was never a Snyder Cut bro either. Every comic book movie I analyze is me giving it to you straight. And I always make the distinction between the ones that I like or dislike versus what I think is good or bad. Those are not the same concepts. Many aspects can be measured with objectivity instead of opinion. But let's first go through the things that I see as a positive. My thoughts about Zack Snyder aside, this is an overall good movie by my standards. If we compare it to recent releases of comic book movies, it's probably great and one of the best comic book movies ever. I'll go as far as to say that this probably should be a standard format for a comic book film going forward. I've never been one to gripe about the length of a movie itself. Some people have short attention spans, and that's y'all's business. But good or bad shouldn't be determined by length. This doesn't mean that a movie can't be pointlessly long, but that's a problem with the content itself, not the length. And when you are dealing with characters that have been around for ages, I think that live action depictions of comic book characters should play the long game anyway. Justice League's length allowed it to bring the characters in without having to make the narrative feel rushed. Steppenwolf's development perhaps benefited the most from this. Hell, the movie probably should have been longer. And a utilization of streaming services allows the audience to pause at any given time. Zack Snyder's Justice League benefits the most from the evolution of how we consume media. But it also gives us a lesson of what comic book based material could look like if they took advantage and played the long game. I know a lot of people aren't going to like the whole slow burn, but I don't mind it one bit. They were faced with a task of trying to attempt to make a team-based movie like it's the Justice League, bro. Though Flash and Aquaman and Cyborg never had their own movies up until that point. This movie should have been long from the get-go. It also does a great job of using stories being told within it, as well as flashbacks to fill the gaps. That was clearly the intention, but it's done in a way that makes sense. Such as Wonder Woman, like she's telling that story of when Darkseid initially lost on Earth and giving us a scene of that war. This was a necessary thing to give the audience perspective and flesh everything out. The next thing I want to credit the movie for is their depictions of not just the characters and their display of power, but the differentiation between them. This is not an easy thing to accomplish. The Aquaman scenes on land put respect on his abilities when you see him do his thing. You have to remember, this is a half Atlantean guy, and aside from him just being in the water and deep sea, that should give him a little bit of strength as his body becomes more acclimated to this. This guy has an incredible amount of physical strength, agility, jumping ability, and such, and we get to see that. All of that is shown, and it's done very well. I mentioned how awesome Wonder Woman was earlier. Batman isn't rendered useless because he doesn't have powers, and that's how it should be. Considering his combat, his gadgets, his suits, they give him enough scenes to have him do his thing among the parademons. Now, Cyborg performs as you think he would, but the best part of this, as I mentioned, is how their powers rival each other. I don't think people understand how good that scene is where they all fight Superman when he's revived. We know he's overpowered. He's supposed to be. But the movie does a great job of showing how he stacks up with the other heroes and levels them out. Such as him not being, let's say, as fast as Flash, but he's about as close as anybody's going to ever get. And I will credit all but one depiction of the heroes in terms of how they act, not when they're using their powers. All but one we'll discuss in a bit. Wonder Woman, though, Superman, and Batman, it feels like those characters. Cyborg even feels like a believable Cyborg. And despite my issues, this feels like a believable Justice League origin movie. And at least they kept the idea of an alien attack being what brought them together. The additions of Darkseid were awesome when we saw him. He's the head honcho here, but he's not the one with boots on the ground, so he's supposed to feel epic when he does appear on screen. And he does. You have this insanely powerful villain in Steppenwolf, and just knowing that there's someone else out there that Steppenwolf looks up to does nothing but amplify Darkseid. The design of Steppenwolf is an interesting one because they're going the route of making him far more alien. He's not more of a humanoid like we've seen him definitely when you talk about the New 52, which was god-awful. Anyway, Darkseid and Steppenwolf's additions are welcome. The support characters also nail their roles. Cyborg's pops couldn't have been played by any better of an actor, and the Amazons have some of the best scenes in the movie. I'll give the movie credit for trying to fit the concepts and nods to the comics in that movie. That's more than I can say for a lot of other comic book films, but this is not a perfect film by any means. And I do have some issues that I want to go through. Though my general perspective on the movie is a positive one, it's going to sound like I'm grilling this movie with my criticisms, but that's not the case. I just have to be far more detailed with my criticisms, and I will still drop some tidbits that I do think are positive. Going right to it though, this version of Flash absolutely sucks. He's almost as bad as Lex Luthor's casting. Ezra Miller in no way, shape, or form embodies Barry Allen. It's not even close. Some of this may be due to Ezra's acting, but most of it is probably how they wrote him. He has this sort of kid Flash thing going on, and he's young, naive, and Cyborg is presented as more mature and older than him. His running form triggers me as well, but that's just the track athlete in me. I can get over that, and the display of his powers are solid, but how he acts, especially in relation to the other characters, is something that I despise. As I've said before, it's not about them being direct and exact adaptations, but some of these changes are needless. We are talking about the first chairman, the first leader that we see when it comes to the Justice League, and this universe has limited him to a bit of a chump. Hands down, he's the worst of the heroes. But this leads me to my next point, and that this movie's plot and relationships, they're influenced by the worst era of DC Comics, and that's Justice League's The New 52. I never liked the idea of Cyborg being like this original member of Justice League. If he comes in, if he helps, whatever, but he's a Titan, man. There's nothing wrong with that. And though I appreciate the mentioning of the Lanterns, it could have made for a much better narrative if they had Hal or even John Stewart there. This would have solidified the new age of heroes. This doesn't mean that they couldn't have introduced Cyborg. Hell, this could have led into a Titans movie that has to be way better than that god-awful show. The reason why drawing influence from the New 52 was stupid is because it pigeonholed them into wasted opportunities. Cyborg's new origin isn't nearly as unique as his original. We saw 2 car crashes like I mentioned earlier, one with him and the Flash, which shows the cheesy direction that they went with it. Teaming up to fight Darkseid and the Parademons is what brought them together in the New 52. Again, that's what they're sort of trying to adapt here. There's just no Hal Jordan, but it's the worst of the Justice League origin stories. I don't understand why they couldn't have just introduced a Lantern, considering they set the scene for it anyway. Also, Martian Manhunter is there, and that's a throwaway. You could have easily had all 7 OG Justice League members. Easily. Some of this may not be Zack Snyder's fault, and I don't want to suggest that it is. It may be that the DC execs were so itching to try to catch up to Marvel that they had to rush these introductions. Possibly, this was the best that Zack could do with the hand that he was dealt with. But we do know that they tried to mesh a bunch of lines, a bunch of storylines and stories, such as like the resurrection and the death of Superman and that pre-sort of Darkseid war. Imagine if they instead got influence from, let's say, when Lex gives Doomsday to Darkseid, which then could have led into a New Gods movie of sort that would have allowed them to address many other things while also giving them some time to introduce like Martian Manhunter and let's say Green Lanterns to the team. But being introduced to Darkseid with him having this long history, but there's no Orion even being mentioned, is something that I just can't take seriously. Not to mention this beta version of Steppenwolf has never been something that I can get with. Dude, he's Darkseid's uncle. And yeah, he fights with him, but as we've mentioned in the history part of this review, dude, when we first got introduced to Steppenwolf, he was like talking to Darkseid like, bro, I don't even like you. So while the scene is set up for a more cool kind of clash with Darkseid, it appears they're going the route of the Darkseid war, which is akin, of course, to the New 52, and that's unfortunate. And who knows what's going to happen with the DC Extended Universe anyway. I think wasting both Doomsday and Darkseid in such a way, back-to-back movies, that was a mistake. But it shows that they didn't really have a long-term goal here, or it was incoherent. They even used the term old gods in the movie, like when they express, or rather explain, like Ares and Zeus. They're not even talking about who predates New Genesis and Apocalypse. The reason why it's so frustrating is because the better this movie is, the more I'm forced to think of what could have been. It does lay a blueprint, though, showing exactly what I've been saying for many years. You can have a good film that honors characters, respects the source material, while also pleasing these normies. It's not rocket science. It just so rarely gets done these days because there are so many hands in the cookie jar, and you get these egotistical shot callers that feel as if they have to leave their imprint on the movies or their imprint on the characters. Play the long game, take your time, and with the evolution of streaming services and utilizing television in the same universe, we should be getting the best comic book depictions of these characters that we're ever going to see. So the DC Extended Universe may have been too early to cash in on this while also being too late at the same time. I have no idea if the release of this movie will, let's say, make everybody, or the producers rather, pivot on their original plans, but I hope they at least consider the blueprint going into the future. I don't think we've scraped the surface of what comic book film could be. But I hope we get these longer movies if they aren't going to do like TV shows. Do whatever you need to do to flesh out the characters and give them life. Though Joker wasn't part of the larger universe, I'm talking about the Joker movie, it shows you that you can also have success in doing movies centered around villains. Both Marvel and DC dropped the ball with this. Instead of Captain Marvel, for example, they should have put out a Thanos origin film, which would have given them the opportunity to introduce other characters like Adam Warlock, who they already alluded to existing. Most importantly, Marvel. Maybe we talk about, I don't know, Moondragon, Mentor. All of that sort of stuff could have happened, but it doesn't. And if they did like a New Gods movie, when it comes to DC, before the Justice League, it would have opened the door for much more. But when it comes to Justice League, I'm saddened by the waste of Martian Manhunter and the lack of Green Lantern. That's more of a criticism of the universe than the movie itself. And it's a shame that it doesn't seem like we're gonna get more like Ben Affleck's Batman, because with the limited time he got, he did what he needed to do. The DC Extended Universe seems to be going full tokenization, just like they're doing right now in the books. Both Marvel and DC, they're obsessed with this stuff. That's probably why Henry Cavill's up out of there, though he's like the best Superman. And, you know, we're going to get like Val Zod and Calvin Ellis, and how the hell is Ta-Nehisi Coates? How did he even get involved in this? But all in all, man, this is a solid movie, okay? It does some great things that hopefully DC Comics utilizes in the future. I'm just not gonna hold my breath. I hope you enjoyed this long form video though, this review, talking about the comic book history, and I plan to do a lot more of these. That comic book history portion, if you didn't watch it, I suggest you go do it, because what it does, it gives you aspect. There have been so many great stories that have been told when it comes to these books. And both mainstream comic books, be it Marvel or DC, they have lore that has some of these classic stories that would cross over very well into live action. A lot of these stories are already wrote for you, and it gives you an opportunity. Y'all got all this money, all of this time these days. We should be getting the best comic book depictions that we are ever going to get. But like I said, I cannot hold my breath on this when you consider the direction that both of these companies are going. It's very unfortunate because DC is sitting on a gold mine right now, and you kind of got a glimpse into that watching Zack Snyder's Justice League, though I have my issues with it. But that's going to wrap it up. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Until next time, y'all be easy. Peace.